My name is Emily Carter, I'm 37, and last month my bakery chain signed a lease on its 7th location. A corner property on 5th Avenue in Manhattan that 3 separate commercial real estate brokers told me would never go to an independent operator. I thought about that lease the entire drive to my sister Olivia's engagement party. Because Olivia's engagement party was being held at my parents' house for the first time in 20 years, and my parents had sent the invitation to my business address instead of my home address, which told me everything I needed to know about why they'd suddenly decided, after 2 decades of silence, that I was worth inviting to something. The house looked the same from the outside. That was the first thing I noticed. Pulling up to the curb in a car my 17-year-old self could never have imagined affording. Same colonial porch, same hydrangeas. My mother planted the summer before everything fell apart. Same porch light that used to come on automatically at dusk. The light was on now, even though it was only 6 in the evening, and I sat in that car for a long moment, hands steady on the wheel, doing the arithmetic I'd been doing since the drive started. 20 years. 2 decades of school pickups and science fair projects and parent-teacher conferences attended alone, of working double shifts at a diner, while Noah slept in a playpen behind the counter, because I couldn't afford a babysitter, of building something from nothing with hands that had no business building anything. Because I was 17 and alone, and everyone who was supposed to catch me had stepped deliberately out of the way instead. 20 years of my son becoming the kind of man his grandfather would brag about at dinner parties, if his grandfather had ever once acknowledged he existed. They hadn't called me in 20 years. Not once. Not for Christmas, not for Noah's birthdays, not when I opened my first bakery location with a loan I'd spent 3 years qualifying for. Not when Noah graduated law school summa cum laude from Columbia. A fact I'd read about in an alumni newsletter and cried over in my car in a parking garage, because I needed somewhere private to feel that size of a feeling. The invitation had arrived 4 weeks ago, cream cardstock with Olivia's name embossed in gold. You are warmly invited to celebrate the engagement of Olivia Marie Carter. And at the bottom, in my mother's handwriting, a line that hadn't been on the printed card. Please come. It would mean so much to the whole family. Bring Noah if he's available. Bring Noah if he's available. 20 years. And my son was an afterthought on the bottom of an engagement invitation. Mentioned the way you mentioned parking validation. Optional, practical, useful if convenient. I'd almost not come. Noah had told me, calmly and without drama, that whatever I decided he would support, that he had no particular need to meet people who hadn't wanted to meet him for the first 20 years of his life. He said it the way he said most things, measured, precise. The voice of a man who had learned, watching his mother, that feelings were most useful when they were organized before being expressed. He was, in that specific way, entirely mine. I came because Olivia had called me separately, on a Sunday afternoon, her voice carrying the particular careful quality of someone who has been rehearsing what to say and is now terrified. It still won't come out right. I know it's a lot to ask, she'd said. I know you don't owe any of us anything, but I miss you. I've missed you for 20 years and I'm getting married. And I can't do it without at least trying to fix this. Olivia had been 12 when our parents threw me out. She hadn't had a say in any of it, and I had known that even then, even at 17, standing on that same porch with a suitcase that held 3 days of clothing and $40 and a positive pregnancy test, I'd already memorized the details of. She'd pressed her face against her bedroom window as I walked down the driveway, and I'd kept walking because stopping would have meant letting myself feel the full weight of what was happening. And I couldn't afford that. Not then, not with $40 and nowhere to go. I got out of the car. The sound of the party reached me before I reached the door. Voices, music from a Bluetooth speaker set up somewhere in the backyard, the particular hum of a family gathering that had been running long enough for everyone to be comfortable. I rang the doorbell instead of walking in, which was its own small statement, ringing the doorbell at a house where I'd once had a key. My mother opened the door. She looked older, which was obvious and somehow still a surprise. Her hair had gone fully silver and she'd stopped fighting it, which suited her. Actually, softened her in a way the blonde she'd maintained throughout my childhood never quite had. She looked at me for a long second that held too many things at once. Relief, guilt, something that might have been love. Though by then I'd stopped being able to identify her love reliably. Since love that disappears, the moment it becomes inconvenient, is a different thing from the love I'd read about in books. Emily, she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the second syllable. You came. I came, I said. She pulled me into a hug before I'd fully decided whether I wanted one. I let it happen. I stood in it with my arms at my sides for a moment before I raised them, because some part of me, the same part that had kept walking down that driveway at 17, needed to make a conscious choice about it rather than just a reflex. The backyard was full of relatives. I recognized in some cases, and didn't in others, people who had been children at the last family event I'd attended, and were now adults with their own children running around the lawn. Olivia found me within 60 seconds, wrapped her arms around me with the specific fierceness of someone who has been waiting a long time to do something, and held on for longer than the occasion technically called for. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for coming. Thank you for asking, I said, and meant it. If you've ever walked back into a room that threw you out and had to decide in real time whether to be the bigger person, drop a comment. I want to know how long it took before you stopped watching the door. My father was by the grill, the way he'd always been at every backyard event of my entire childhood, holding court with a pair of tongs and an audience of 2 cousins who were laughing at something he'd just said. Richard Carter had always known how to own a room. It was, in a specific and painful way, a trait Noah had inherited without ever meeting the man who'd passed it down. He saw me from across the yard. I watched his expression go through 3 things in about 2 seconds. Surprise, something complicated, and then the practiced composure of a man who had spent 40 years in real estate, negotiating his face into whatever expression the room required. He handed the tongs to the cousin nearest him and walked toward me with the deliberate ease of a man approaching a conversation he'd been rehearsing. Emily. He extended his hand, which told me everything. A handshake for his own daughter at his younger daughter's engagement party. I'm glad you're here. I shook it. I want to be honest about that. I shook my father's hand at my sister's engagement party. Because it was what he'd offered, and I wasn't ready to offer more than he was. And I'd learned 20 years ago that extending more than you have toward people who've emptied you is its own kind of loss. Noah couldn't make it tonight, I said before he could ask. He had a case deadline. Something moved across my father's face. Not disappointment exactly, but a particular kind of recalculation. The way a number changes when a variable you were counting on doesn't come through. I filed that away. The way I'd been filing things away since the invitation arrived. The same instinct that had made me, at 17, write down every detail of the night I was thrown out in a notebook I still had, somewhere in a box in my apartment. Not for revenge. Just because I'd learned early that documented truth and remembered truth were 2 different categories, and only one of them held up when you needed it to. We ate dinner on the lawn as the sun went down, and I sat between Olivia and a cousin named Marcus, who asked me genuinely curious questions about the bakery business and seemed actually interested in the answers, which was more than I could say for most of the table. My mother kept glancing at me from her seat across the table. The same quick checking glance she'd given me my entire childhood. The one that meant she was monitoring something about my expression, but didn't want me to know she was doing it. My father gave a toast. He talked about Olivia's warmth, her talent for bringing people together, the way she'd always known exactly who she was. He talked about family, the word landing in my chest with a specific dull weight, the way a word lands, when it has been used in front of you to mean something that excluded you, specifically. He talked about the future, about new chapters, about the people gathered here tonight, representing everything that mattered. He didn't look at me when he said it. I didn't expect him to. I drove home 2 hours later, past the elementary school where I'd found out Noah had a gift for reading at age 4, past the community center, where I'd taken a small business development course. At 23 with Noah asleep in a stroller beside my chair, past the diner where I'd worked double shifts for 4 years, with a laminated photo of Noah taped inside my locker, because some days the only way through was to keep looking at the reason for it. somewhere on the highway, my phone rang through the car speakers. Noah. How was it? He asked. Fine, I said, which was true in the way that fine covers things that are actually several layers deep and not yet ready to be sorted through. Your grandfather asked about you. A pause. What did he say? He didn't say anything directly, I said. He didn't have to. It was the way he looked when I told him you couldn't make it. Like he'd been counting on a variable and found out it wasn't available. Another pause, longer this time. The kind Noah took when he was applying the same precision to a personal conversation that he applied to legal arguments. Mom, he finally said. What aren't you telling me? I thought about my father's handshake, about the line at the bottom of the invitation in my mother's handwriting, about 20 years of silence that had apparently, somehow, found a reason to end. I'll tell you everything, I said. But not tonight. Tonight I just need to drive. He let me. That was the thing about Noah that had always undone me in the best possible way. He knew when to press and when to give the silence back. He'd learned it the same place. I'd learned everything that actually mattered. Not from the family that threw us out, but from the life we'd built in the space that their absence left. The morning after Olivia's engagement party, I woke up at 5 the way I always do. Not from an alarm, but from 20 years of muscle memory. The body refusing to unlearn the schedule it built. When Noah was an infant, and sleep was something you stole in 2-hour increments between feedings, and the particular anxiety of knowing that if you overslept, nobody else was going to pick up the slack. I lay there in the dark for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, doing the thing I'd been doing since the drive home. Turning the evening over in my mind, the way you turn a piece of dough, looking for the places where it hadn't developed properly. The handshake. The look on my father's face when I mentioned Noah's case deadline. My mother's quick, monitoring glances across the dinner table. The way nobody in that backyard had once, in 4 hours, asked me a single question about Noah himself. What he was like, what kind of law he practiced, whether he was happy. They'd asked if he was coming. They hadn't asked who he was. That distinction had been sitting in my chest since the highway, and by 5 in the morning, I'd named it clearly enough to write it down, which I did, in the same plain notebook habit I'd kept since I was 17. Not a journal exactly, more like a running record of things I needed to be able to verify. Later, a habit born from the night, my parents had rewritten the story of my pregnancy in real time, right in front of me, turning my truth into their version so smoothly and so quickly that, for a brief, disorienting moment, I'd almost believed them. I wasn't 17 anymore. I knew how to document things now. Noah came for breakfast on Sunday, the way he did. Most Sundays when his caseload allowed, arriving I at 9 with coffee he'd picked up from the place 2 blocks from his apartment. Because he knew I'd already made a pot, but liked the ritual of bringing something anyway. He was 20 years old in my memory most mornings. Even now, some persistent glitch in the way mothers process time. And then he'd walk through the door and be fully, completely himself. 6'1", the same jaw his father had given him, and absolutely nothing else, and I'd recalibrate. Tell me about last night, he said, settling at my kitchen counter with his cup. So I did. All of it. The handshake. The invitation's handwritten postscript. The way my father had looked when Noah's name came up. The 20 years of unacknowledged absence sitting in the middle of a backyard full of people, pretending it wasn't there. Noah listened. The way he always listened, completely still, his coffee cup held without drinking from it, the same stillness he'd had since he was small, the kind that made teachers call me in to ask if he was okay, and I'd had to explain that he wasn't sad. He was just thinking. He'd always been a thinker. He'd learned it early because thinking was the first thing I'd taught him was safe. What did they want? He asked when I finished. I don't know yet, I said, but they wanted something. Nobody ends 20 years of silence for an engagement party. He set his coffee down. Dad's in trouble, he said. I looked at him. What do you mean? Richard Carter, he said, using my father's full name, with the precise, neutrally professional distance he used for clients, which told me he'd already been thinking about this since I'd called him from the highway. He's under federal investigation for real estate fraud, securities violations, wire fraud, potentially money laundering through property transactions across 3 states. It's been building for about 18 months. I know about it because two of the firms connected to the case reached out to my practice 6 weeks ago about consulting on the defense side. The kitchen went very quiet. You didn't tell me, I said. I didn't want to tell you until I knew whether it was going to intersect with our lives, he said. I was hoping it wouldn't. I sat with that for a long moment, doing arithmetic I hadn't expected to be doing on a Sunday morning. 20 years of silence. An engagement party invitation sent to my business address. A handwritten note asking if Noah was available. My father's face when I said he had a case deadline. They knew they'd known before the invitation was sent. They hadn't ended 20 years of silence because Olivia was getting married. They'd ended it because Richard Carter was looking at federal charges and had apparently, somewhere in the course of that investigation, discovered that the grandson he'd rejected before birth had become one of the most effective trial lawyers in New York. If you've ever found out someone came back into your life, not because they missed you, but because they needed something you had, drop a comment. I want to know if you were surprised, or if some part of you already knew. I got up and refilled my coffee, mostly just to do something with my hands. What happens if he's convicted? I asked. Significant prison time, Noah said. The fraud runs into the tens of millions. Federal prosecutors are thorough, and they're not interested in deals that don't involve substantial cooperation. He needs exceptional representation, and he needs it immediately, because the preliminary hearings are already scheduled. And someone told him you were exceptional, I said. Someone told his legal team, Noah said. I've had 2 calls in the last month from people connected to his case. I didn't know at the time they were connected to him specifically. I know now. I looked at my son across my kitchen counter, this man I had raised from a terrified Tuesday night with $40 and a positive pregnancy test to this, to coffee on Sunday mornings, and a practice that federal defense teams called when they were desperate, and I felt something I couldn't immediately name. Not anger, though there was anger underneath it. Something older than anger. The specific exhaustion of having known, at 17, that you were being thrown away for someone else's comfort. And watching 20 years later, that same dynamic try to reassemble itself around a different need. What are you going to do? I asked. I haven't decided, he said. I wanted to talk to you first. That was the thing that undid me, quietly, in the way things that matter most always undid me quietly. Not that he'd come, not that he'd told me, but that he'd said, I wanted to talk to you first. 20 years of being the only parent, the only constant, and he still came to me first. He always came to me first. I thought about the diner where I'd worked when he was small, the grease smell that had lived in my hair for 4 years, regardless of how many times I washed it. I thought about the apartment we'd shared until he was 8, the one where the radiator made a sound like someone knocking on the wall at 3 in the morning, and I'd had to explain to a 4-year-old Noah that it was just the pipes, just the heat. Nothing to be scared of, while I sat on the edge of his bed at 3 in the morning, wondering how long I could keep being the person who knew, for certain. There was nothing to be scared of when I wasn't sure I believed it myself. I thought about the small business loan application. I'd filled out 3 times before it was approved, the one where the loan officer had told me, not unkindly, that my credit history was thin and my collateral minimal, and I should maybe consider a different path, and I'd looked at him across his desk with the same steady composure. I'd been practicing since I was 17, and said I didn't have a different path, and I'd appreciate him reconsidering. He'd reconsidered. The first bakery had opened 8 months later, in a small commercial space in a neighborhood. Nobody was sure about yet, and it had been profitable within 14 months, which every small business resource I'd ever read told me was faster than average. I'd framed the first profit statement and hung it in my office not out of vanity, but because I needed to be able to look at it on the days that felt impossible, and in the early years there were a lot of those days. My father had never once walked through any of my 7 locations. My mother had sent a card when the first one opened. A generic congratulations card from a drugstore, signed simply, Mom and Dad. No message, no phone number, no suggestion that the card was the beginning of anything, rather than simply itself. I'd kept it, filed in the same box as the notebook from the night they'd thrown me out, because I kept everything. Because I'd learned at 17 that memory alone wasn't reliable enough. "Tell me what you're thinking," I said to Noah. He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in a slow circle on the counter. "I'm thinking that he's a client, or he would be a client, and clients are clients regardless of personal history. That's not complicated for me professionally." He paused. "Personally is a different question." "Personally," I said. "Personally, I'm thinking about the fact that he threw my mother out of his house at 17 with $40 and a suitcase and never once called to find out whether she survived it." His voice stayed even, but something underneath it had an edge I recognized. Not hot anger, not the kind that shouts, but the cold and very specific kind that has been sitting somewhere for a long time and has only recently been given a reason to surface. And that the first time he decides to acknowledge I exist, it's because he needs something from me. "Yes," I said. "That's what's happening." "So the question," Noah said, "isn't whether I can take his case. The question is whether taking it serves anything other than his interests." I looked at him for a long moment. This man I had built from scratch with nothing but time and love, and the refusal to believe that being abandoned made you abandonable. "What would serving something other than his interests look like?" I asked. He picked up his coffee again, finally drank from it. "I'm not sure yet," he said, "but I want to find out what actually happened with the fraud case before I decide anything. Because if there's something in those files that's more complicated than what the prosecution is saying, and there usually is, then I want to know what it is before I decide whether walking away is the right thing or just the satisfying thing." That was the moment I understood, clearly and completely, that my son was not only the best thing I had ever done. He was a better person than his grandfather deserved, and possibly better than the situation called for, which meant he was going to take the case. Not because Richard Carter had earned it, but because Noah Carter didn't make decisions based on what people had earned. He made them based on what was right. I'd taught him that. I want to be clear about that. Because there were years when I wasn't sure what I was teaching him. Years when I thought the lessons poverty and exhaustion and loneliness were writing into his childhood might be damage rather than character. I know now the difference, though it took longer to know than I would have liked. Over the following 2 weeks, Noah quietly pulled everything publicly available on Richard Carter's fraud case. Federal filings, property records, business entity registrations, transaction records across the 3 states named in the indictment. He didn't tell my parents he was doing it. He didn't tell my father's existing legal team. He simply read, the way he'd always read, thoroughly, and without announcing it. Because Noah had learned from watching me run a business that preparation done quietly and competently was worth more than preparation performed loudly. He called me on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after the engagement party breakfast. "Mom," he said. And something in the way he said it made me set down the inventory spreadsheet I'd been reviewing and give the call my full attention. "There's something in these filings that doesn't fit." "What do you mean?" "The fraud structure," he said. "The way the property transactions are layered. It's sophisticated enough that it required someone with specific technical knowledge of how to exploit gaps in cross-state securities reporting. Someone who knew exactly which documentation thresholds to stay under, and how to use shell entities to move money between transactions without triggering automatic audits." A pause. "Your father is a real estate investor. He's good at it. But this level of structural complexity isn't something he built on his own. You think someone else designed it." "I think there's a second person in this case that the prosecution hasn't fully named yet," Noah said. "And I think your father may not be the architect. He may be the face." I sat with that for a long moment, 20 years of silence, from a man I'd once watched throw his 17-year-old daughter out of his house without blinking, and now the possibility that the man himself had been used by someone smarter and less visible. I didn't feel sorry for him. I want to be clear about that. Whatever had happened in that fraud case, whatever someone had or hadn't done to my father, it existed entirely separately from the thing he'd done to me, which nobody had orchestrated for him, which had been entirely and freely his own choice. But I felt something shift in the shape of what was coming, because Noah had that look. the one I'd watched develop across 20 years of homework and debate club and law school and early casework. The look of a man who had found a thread he was going to pull until the whole structure either held or came apart. He was going to take the case. Not because Richard Carter deserved him. Because the case had something in it that Noah needed to understand, and Noah had never in his life been capable of walking away from a thing he needed to understand. I closed my inventory spreadsheet and opened a new document instead. Blank page, cursor blinking. I started writing down everything I remembered about the night I was thrown out. Not for the first time, but newly, with the specific detail of someone who now understood that memory, combined with 20 years of documented evidence, was about to become relevant in ways I hadn't anticipated when I'd first pulled up to that colonial porch 2 weeks ago. I wrote until midnight. When I finally stopped, I had 14 pages, single-spaced, and my coffee had gone cold twice. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Olivia's engagement party. While I was doing inventory at the 5th Avenue location before opening, my mother's number on the screen, not Olivia's, not a text. My mother, calling my personal cell, which meant she'd gotten the number from Olivia, because I'd never given it to her directly, which meant this call had been planned, discussed, coordinated between at least 2 people before it happened. I let it ring twice. Then I answered. Emily. Her voice had that particular careful quality, the one she used when she was managing something, the same voice she'd used when she'd explained to relatives, at family gatherings. I'd later hear about secondhand that I'd chosen to leave home young rather than been thrown out of it with $40 and 3 days of clothing. I was hoping we could talk, properly. Just the 2 of us. We're talking now, I said. A small pause. She hadn't expected me to keep it on the phone. She'd expected me to arrange a lunch, a setting she could control, tablecloths and coffee cups as props for a conversation she'd rehearsed. I'd learned, running 7 bakery locations, that the person who chooses the setting usually controls the narrative, and I wasn't interested in her narrative anymore. Your father is in some trouble, she said, and the understatement of it, some trouble, for federal fraud charges that had been building for 18 months across 3 states, told me she still hadn't fully abandoned the version of Richard Carter she'd constructed and maintained for 60 years, the one where problems were things that happened to him rather than things he'd built. I know about the case, I said. Another pause, longer. Noah told you. Noah and I talk, I said. We've always talked. That's what happens when someone is your only family for 20 years. The sentence landed the way I intended it to. Not as an attack, just as a fact, stated with the same flatness I used for inventory numbers. She absorbed it in silence. We made mistakes, she said finally. Your father and I know we did. I set down the clipboard I'd been holding and leaned against the counter, looking out through the front window at 5th Avenue, beginning to fill with morning foot traffic, people in work clothes carrying coffee, a city that had nothing to do with a colonial porch in Texas and everything to do with what I'd built after I'd walked away from it. Mom, I said, and the words still cost something, even now, even after everything. Some words don't stop costing regardless of how long you've been paying. I'm not going to tell Noah what to do about Dad's case. He's going to make that decision himself, the way he makes all his decisions. I raised him to think for himself, not to ask me for permission. I know, she said. I know that. I wanted to hear your voice. I wanted you to know that I think about it, what we did. I think about it more than you probably believe I do. I thought about being 17, walking down that driveway. Her face not at the window the way Olivia's had been. I'd looked for her face at the window. I'd looked without meaning to. Some reflex I hadn't managed to suppress even in that moment. Some animal need to see whether the person who was supposed to protect you was watching you leave. She hadn't been at the window. She'd been somewhere inside the house, and I'd never asked where, and she'd never told me. I believe you think about it, I said carefully. I just don't know what you want me to do with that. She didn't have an answer. We talked for 11 more minutes about nothing consequential. Olivia's wedding venue shortlist, a cousin's new baby, the hydrangeas she'd replanted along the front porch, normal things. Family-shaped conversation held between 2 people, navigating the specific wreckage of a family. And I let it run because some part of me, The part that would apparently never entirely stop being her daughter, regardless of what she'd done, needed 11 minutes of normal, even knowing it was constructed. I hung up and stood in my empty bakery. For a long moment, the smell of the morning's first bake coming through from the kitchen. Brown butter and vanilla. The specific warmth of it, the smell that had been my life's work and my salvation. And the thing I'd built when I had nothing else to build. If you've ever had a parent call to apologize, but the apology was really just set up for the thing they actually needed, drop a comment. I want to know if you answered, and what it cost you. Noah called that evening. He'd made his decision. I'm going to look at the case formally, he said. Not as his lawyer yet, as an independent review. I want to understand the full structure before I commit to anything. What changed? I asked. I found the second person, he said. The one I thought was in the filings. His name is Gerald Marsh. He's been Richard's business partner for 11 years, and the fraud structure maps almost entirely onto deals that Marsh originated, and Richard signed off on. Marsh has already entered into preliminary cooperation discussions with the prosecution. I understood immediately what that meant, the way I'd learned over the years to translate Noah's legal precision into plain consequence. Gerald Marsh was going to testify against my father, and he was going to do it in exchange for his own reduced sentence, which meant the story the prosecution was going to tell was going to be Gerald Marsh's story, with Richard Carter as its primary villain, whether that was accurate or not. He's being set up to take the fall, I said. He may have also genuinely participated in fraud, Noah said evenly. I want to be clear about that. Finding a second person doesn't make your father innocent. It makes the case more complicated than a straightforward conviction, which is a different thing. But someone needs to make that argument in court. Someone does, Noah said. And right now, nobody on his existing legal team has found Marsh's early communications, which I found in a subsidiary filing that wasn't indexed correctly in the main case documents. Which means nobody defending him currently knows what I know. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd sat with him 3 weeks ago over coffee, doing the same arithmetic I'd been doing my entire adult life. Not how to feel about something, but what to do with the feeling once I'd identified it clearly enough to act on. 20 years. My father's handshake at Olivia's party. My mother's voice saying some trouble like it was a parking ticket. The $40 in my coat pocket the night I walked down that driveway. The specific weight of it, not enough, and I'd known it wasn't enough even then. If you take this case, I said slowly, I need you to do something for me. Anything. Noah said immediately. The word arriving before the request did, which was the thing about my son that had always been both his greatest quality and the thing that occasionally scared me. His willingness to commit to me before he knew what I was asking. I need you to do it because it's right, I said. Not because it'll give either of us any kind of satisfaction. Not because it'll make them feel something. If you walk into that courtroom, I need it to be because the case deserves the best defense, and you're the best defense. Not because we need to prove something to people who already had 20 years to figure out who we are. A long pause. When Noah spoke again, his voice was quieter. You raised me better than that, he said. I know I did, I said. I just needed to hear you say it. He took the case the following Monday, not with fanfare, not with a phone call to my parents that anyone orchestrated or celebrated. He simply filed the paperwork with his firm and informed Richard Carter's existing legal team that he'd be coming in as lead counsel, effective immediately, which caused, Noah told me afterward, with the dry understatement he'd inherited from somewhere, I'd like to think was me, a fairly significant reaction. What I did not expect and should have, because I'd spent 20 years learning that the things you don't expect are usually the things that were always coming, was Ethan Brooks. He showed up at my Fifth Avenue location on a Wednesday afternoon. 9 days after Noah took the case, walking through the door in a jacket that said he'd done well for himself, but had never quite stopped. Being the 18-year-old from Texas, who'd looked me in the eye and said the baby wasn't his. He was heavier now, his hair starting to gray at the temples. And he looked, walking through the door of a bakery I owned on Fifth Avenue, like a man who had spent 20 years occasionally reconsidering a decision and had finally run out of time to keep reconsidering it quietly. I was behind the counter. I didn't move. He walked up and stood across the glass case from me, looking at me with an expression I didn't have an easy name for. Not guilt exactly, or not only guilt, something older and more complicated underneath it. Emily, he said. Ethan, I said. I heard Noah took Richard's case, he said. News travels, I said. I need to tell you something, he said. I've needed to tell you for a long time, He stopped. Looked at the pastry case between us like it was a geographical feature he wasn't sure how to navigate. My parents made me deny it, the pregnancy. They threatened to cut me off completely. Tuition, everything. If I acknowledged the baby was mine. I was 18. I was terrified. I told myself you'd be fine, that you had your family, that it would work out. He looked up. I knew the whole time, I always knew Noah was my son. The bakery was quiet around us. Mid-afternoon, lull, 2 customers at a corner table, not paying attention to anything but their laptops. I looked at Ethan Brooks across a glass case full of croissants and brown butter tarts in a bakery on 5th Avenue that I had built with my own hands starting from nothing. And I felt, not the rage I might have expected, not the grief either, both of which I'd already spent on him in the years, when I'd had the energy to spend anything on him. What I felt was something closer to completion, the specific sensation of a variable that had been left open for 20 years finally resolving into a value. I know, I said. He blinked. You know, I've always known your parents were behind it, I said. I was 17, not stupid. I knew what your family thought of me. I knew what being connected to a teenage pregnancy would cost them in the circles they cared about. I paused. I just needed to hear you say it. For Noah's sake, not mine. He absorbed that. Does Noah know about me? No, knows he has a biological father who denied him before he was born, I said. He knows the broad shape of it. The details are yours to give him. If you decide you're ready to do that, and if he decides he's interested in receiving them. Is he? I have no idea, I said honestly. He's his own person. He's been his own person since he was about 4 years old. You'd have to ask him yourself. Ethan nodded slowly, like a man processing a landscape that looked different up close than it had from whatever distance he'd been maintaining for 20 years. I'm sorry, Emily, he said, for all of it. I know, I said again, because I believed him, and because believing him didn't change anything about the 20 years that had happened in the space his absence created, and because I'd learned, somewhere in the middle years of building something from nothing, that accepting an apology and letting it rewrite history were 2 entirely different transactions. He left after a few minutes, back through the glass door and into the foot traffic on 5th Avenue, and I watched him go the same way. I'd watched other things go, other people, other versions of what my life might have been if the variables had been different. If you've ever gotten the apology you waited years for and found out it landed differently than you thought it would, drop a comment. Tell me what it actually felt like versus what you expected. That night I sat at my kitchen table with the notebook I'd been keeping. Since I was 17, not the original, which had filled up decades ago, but the current volume of a continuous record I'd maintained through 7 bakery locations and 20 years of school pickups, and a son who'd grown into someone better than any of the people who'd decided he didn't deserve to exist. I wrote down Ethan's visit, word for word as best I could remember it, dated it, filed it with the rest, not because I needed it for anything specific. Because I'd learned at 17, walking down a driveway with $40, that the only person reliably responsible for preserving your own truth was you, and that the habit of documenting it was something you kept even after you stopped needing it to survive. Because some habits are worth keeping, not for what they protect you from, but for what they remind you you've already survived. I closed the notebook, made tea, and thought about my son in a courtroom. I hadn't seen yet, building a defense for a man who'd never once built anything for him. Doing it because it was right, which was the most Emily Carter thing Noah Brooks had ever done, and also the most himself. I thought about my father in a house in Texas, waiting. I thought about my mother at a window she'd been standing at for 20 years, looking at something she'd already lost and not entirely understanding yet what it was going to cost her to finally see it clearly. I drank my tea. I went to bed. In the morning, I opened the 5th Avenue location at 6, same as every morning, and stood behind the counter while the city outside began its ordinary, enormous day and felt, for the first time in weeks, something that wasn't arithmetic or documentation or the specific management of old pain. I felt, quietly and without fanfare, like a woman standing exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because anyone had put her there, but because she'd built the floor herself and knew every board in it. The lunch with my father lasted 47 minutes. I know the exact time because I checked my watch when I sat down, and again when I stood up to leave. A habit I'd developed in my first years of running the bakery, when every meeting had a cost measurable in the hours. I wasn't spending on things that actually moved the business forward. Time, I'd learned at 17 with nothing but $40, was the only resource that couldn't be borrowed or refinanced or restructured. Once it was spent, it was simply gone, and I'd stopped spending mine carelessly somewhere around the third year of raising Noah alone. My father was already seated when I arrived, which surprised me. Richard Carter had always been a man who arrived last to things, who let rooms wait for him rather than waiting for rooms. He looked smaller than I remembered, which was probably just age, and the particular diminishment that legal trouble does to people who have spent their entire lives being the one with leverage. He had a glass of water in front of him he hadn't touched, and his hands were folded on the table in a way that looked deliberate, controlled, like he was managing something. I sat down. I didn't hug him. He didn't offer. "You look well," he said. "I am well," I said, which was true, and also a statement. Not a pleasantry returned, but a fact reported. I was well. I had built something from the wreckage of the night he'd handed me a suitcase and closed his front door. And I was well, and I needed him to understand that the wellness was mine and had nothing to do with him. He ordered water. I ordered coffee. We looked at menus neither of us was actually reading. "I owe you an apology," he said, setting his menu down. "I've owed you one for 20 years. "Yes," I said. "You have." He blinked, slightly. He'd expected something softer, I think. Some reflexive. "It's okay," or "I appreciate that." That would let the apology land cleanly and move us quickly on to the subject he'd actually called about. I didn't give it to him. I'd spent 20 years giving people easier landings than they'd earned, and I was done with the practice. "Your mother and I made decisions," he said, "that we've both come to understand were wrong." We were, he paused, searching for language. We were more concerned with how things looked than with what was right. That's not an excuse. I know it's not an excuse. "No," I agreed. "It's not." "Emily, I want to say something before you get to Noah," I said, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at the name. At the fact that I'd named what was coming, before he could arrive at it on his own terms. "Because I've been waiting 20 years to say it in a room where you had a reason to hear it. And this is apparently the room." He nodded, once, controlled. "The face he used with clients. The night you threw me out," I said, keeping my voice even, the same voice I used for difficult conversations with employees, with loan officers, with wholesale buyers who thought a small independent operator could be pressured into a worse contract than she deserved. I was 17 years old. I had $40. I had no plan, no support, and a pregnancy that terrified me. And I walked down that driveway because you gave me no other option, and I kept walking because stopping would have meant letting myself feel the full size of what you'd done, and I couldn't afford to feel it. Not then. He was looking at the table. "I raised my son alone," I said. "I worked double shifts in a diner with him in a playpen behind the counter. I filled out a small business loan application 3 times before someone approved it. I built 7 locations. I did all of it without a single phone call from you. Not to ask if I was alive, not to ask if he was healthy, not once, for 20 years. I stopped. And then Olivia got engaged, and you found out Noah was a trial lawyer, and you sent an invitation to my business address, and wrote his name at the bottom like a postscript. And now you're sitting across from me in a restaurant, telling me you owe me an apology. Which is true, but we both know the apology isn't why you called." Silence. "So say what you actually need to say," I said. "And I'll tell you what I actually need to say back, and then we'll both know where we stand." My father looked up from the table. Something in his expression had shifted. The client management composure had dropped, partly, enough for me to see underneath it, and what was underneath it was older and less composed than I'd expected. He looked for a moment, like someone who had been carrying something for a long time, and had finally been given permission to set it down, even though the permission had come in the form of his daughter refusing to make things easy for him. "I need Noah's help," he said. "I think you know that." "I know that. The fraud case. I didn't build the structure they're saying I built. I was used by someone who understood exactly how to use a name like mine and a portfolio like mine to make something look legitimate. That wasn't. I need someone who can prove that in court, and Noah is." He stopped. "Noah is apparently the best there is at exactly this kind of case." "He is," I said. "He's extraordinary. He's been extraordinary since he was 4 years old, and I was too exhausted to fully appreciate it in the moment. He's extraordinary because he worked for it, and because he had no safety net, and because he watched his mother build something from nothing for 20 years, and decided that was the standard." I picked up my coffee cup. "You don't get credit for that. I want to be clear about that." "I know," he said. "If you've ever sat across from someone who hurt you, and had to decide, in real time, whether their need for you now changed what they did to you then, drop a comment. I need to know I'm not the only one who has had to do that math at a lunch table." "I'm not going to tell Noah what to do," I said. "He's a 37-year-old man and a practicing attorney, and the decision about whether to take your case belongs to him entirely. That's not my call to make." I set my cup down. "What I'm going to tell you is this. If he takes it because it's the right case for him professionally, not because you're his grandfather. And if he takes it, you don't get to introduce him at the courthouse steps as your grandson. You don't get to tell your friends and your colleagues about your remarkable grandchild. You don't get 20 years of absence and then the highlight reel when it's convenient." My father's jaw worked. "That's fair," he said quietly. "It's not about fair," I said. "Fair would have been 20 years ago. This is just the truth of what's available now." I paid for my own coffee, told him I'd pass along his situation to Noah without editorial, and walked out of that restaurant into the early afternoon light, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel. Not relief, not triumph, but a specific lightness, like a load-bearing wall in my chest had discovered. It wasn't actually required to hold anything up anymore, and had simply, quietly put the weight down. Noah heard the full account that evening over the phone. Every detail, every pause, the exact words I'd used, and the exact words my father had used back. He listened with the same complete stillness he'd brought to every important conversation of his life. "I'm taking the case," he said when I finished. "I know," I said. "Not for him. I know that too. There's someone else in those filings," he said, "who's been very careful to stay invisible, and I don't like invisible. I've never liked things that hide behind other things." A pause. "That's probably your influence." "Probably," I said. "The trial preparation took 4 months. I won't detail all of it here, because most of it happened in rooms I wasn't in conversations between Noah and his legal team, and eventually between Noah and my father's existing counsel, who had the grace to recognize they were outmatched on the structural complexity of the case, and stepped into supporting roles without being asked twice. Noah had that effect on rooms, not through volume or performance, but through the particular gravity of someone who had done the work so thoroughly that arguments against him simply didn't find purchase. What I know of those 4 months is this. Noah pulled apart the transaction records layer by layer, identified a business partner of my father's named Gerald Marsh, who had spent 3 years systematically building a fraud structure designed to be discoverable at exactly the level where Richard Carter's name appeared, and invisible at the level where Gerald Marsh's decisions actually lived. It was sophisticated and patient, and it had very nearly worked. And the reason it hadn't worked was that Noah Carter didn't stop pulling threads when the obvious answer appeared. He kept pulling until he found the thread underneath the obvious answer, and then he pulled that one too. Ethan Brooks appeared 2 weeks before the trial date. I hadn't seen him since I was 17. I want to be precise about that. 20 years, and he'd been exactly as absent from my life as my parents had been, which was to say completely, without exception, without a single call or letter, or any acknowledgement that he had left a person behind when he'd denied paternity and let his parents' money do the deciding. He called my bakery's main line, which told me he'd looked me up, which meant he'd known where I was for at least some amount of time before he called. I took the call in my office, door closed. I know I don't have a right to call, he said. No, I said. You don't. I've known Noah was mine since he was born, he said. I want you to know that. I've always known. My parents told me to deny it because they didn't want the association. I was 18 and I did what they told me, and I've lived with it for 20 years. I let the silence sit for a long moment. 20 years of wondering, not often, but sometimes, in the late nights when Noah was small and I was exhausted, and the arithmetic of doing everything alone felt genuinely impossible. Wondering whether Ethan had ever thought about the child he'd denied, whether the denial had cost him anything at all, or whether it had simply been a clean exit he'd walked through without looking back. Why are you telling me now? I asked. Because Noah's about to be in a courtroom, he said. And if it comes out there, which it might, because his grandfather's legal history is going to be examined, and that includes family history. I didn't want him to find out from a deposition. I wanted him to find out from me. That's 20 years too late, I said. I know. Have you told Noah directly? Not yet, I called you first. I thought about that for a moment. The same instinct Noah had. Come to me first. Except in Ethan's case, it wasn't love driving it. It was guilt, which was a different engine, slower and less reliable. I'll tell him you called, I said. What he does with that is his decision, the same as everything else. I stopped making decisions for Noah about his own life when he was old enough to make them himself. Emily Ethan, I said, the name feeling strange after 20 years, familiar and foreign at the same time. I spent the better part of Noah's childhood, answering his questions about his father as honestly as I could, without making him carry a bitterness I didn't want him to have. I told him you were young and scared, and that sometimes people make choices they can't take back. I didn't tell him you were a coward, because I didn't want that to be the story he carried, about half of where he came from. I paused. But he's 37 now, and if you want to tell him the truth, you tell him directly. Don't put it through me again. I hung up and sat in my office for a long time, the bakery sounds filtering through the closed door. The mixer running in the back. Someone laughing near the counter, the particular rhythmic sounds of a business that existed, and ran and fed people, and employed people, because I had decided at 17 that survival was non-negotiable. Noah met with Ethan privately, 2 days later. He didn't tell me what was said, exactly, and I didn't ask. He came for coffee the following Sunday, and seemed, to my careful eye, the same, perhaps slightly more complete, in the way people sometimes are. After finally receiving a piece of information they've organized their understanding of themselves around the absence of. He didn't seem shattered. He didn't seem particularly softened either. He seemed like himself, which was the best outcome I could have hoped for. The trial lasted 6 days. I attended 2 of them, sitting in the gallery with Sophie, who held my hand during the closing argument without being asked, the way she'd been holding things for me since nursing school. When I'd been the new girl with the baby, and she'd simply decided, without announcement, that she was going to be in my corner. Noah was extraordinary in that courtroom. I'm not going to pretend to be objective about it, because I'm his mother, and objectivity has never been part of our arrangement. But I watched 12 jurors watch him, and I watched the jury watching shift from professional attention to the specific kind of quiet that happens in a room. When someone is saying something true, in a way that makes the truth feel inevitable, and I understood why federal defense teams called his practice when they were genuinely afraid. He dismantled Gerald Marsh's invisible role piece by piece, transaction record by transaction record, entity registration by entity registration, until the structure that had been designed to implicate my father and obscure Marsh was simply and completely inverted in front of everyone. By the end of the 4th day, Marsh's own attorney was requesting a recess that everyone in the room understood meant a conversation about cooperation with the prosecution. My father was acquitted on the primary counts. Marsh was not outside the courthouse afterward. The light was that particular late afternoon. Gold, that makes everything look cleaner than it is. Reporters gathered at the bottom of the steps, the usual cluster, microphones, ready for Noah, who gave a brief professional statement and nothing more, because Noah had never needed an audience for anything that actually mattered to him. My father found me at the edge of the steps, away from the cameras. He looked wrung out, lighter and hollower at the same time. The way people look after a sustained fear finally releases them. Not restored, exactly, but emptied of the particular weight they'd been carrying. He started to say something. I could see it forming, the gratitude, the relief, the version of reconciliation he'd been building toward since the engagement party invitation. Emily, he said. I don't know how to. You don't have to, I said quietly. I don't need you to find the words. I want to, he said. I owe you more than an apology at a lunch table. I owe you 20 years. You can't give me 20 years, I said. That's not how time works. You can give me whatever comes after today, if you want to, and I'll decide what to do with it as it comes. I looked at him. My father, older and smaller than the man who had handed me a suitcase and closed a door, standing at the bottom of courthouse steps because my son had kept him out of prison. But I need you to understand something first. He waited. You didn't lose me the day you threw me out, I said. You lost me the day you never came back. The throwing out I understood, in a terrible way. You were ashamed, and you were afraid, and you made a bad decision. And people make bad decisions from shame and fear. And I've spent 20 years understanding that even when I couldn't forgive it. But the 20 years of silence after. That was a choice you kept making every year, every holiday, every birthday. That wasn't one bad decision, that was 1,000 of them. I paused. I need you to know I know the difference. He nodded, and something in his face cracked open, the way faces crack, when someone has finally been told a truth they've been avoiding, and can no longer find a reason to argue with it. I know, he said. I know the difference too. Noah appeared beside me a moment later, still in his courtroom suit, briefcase in hand, and looked at my father with the calm, professionally neutral expression he'd worn for 6 days in that courtroom. Richard, he said, using my father's first name, deliberate and precise. My father looked at him. Really looked, maybe for the first time, the way you look at someone when you're finally allowing yourself to see them instead of what they represent. I defended my client, Noah said simply. That's what I do. My father understood. I watched him understand it. That the grandson who had just saved him from prison had done it as an attorney, not as a grandson, and that the distinction was everything. That it meant the debt ran in exactly one direction, and would never be erased by a courtroom outcome, or a lunch, or 1,000 belated apologies. Noah put his hand briefly on my shoulder. Just a touch, warm and certain, the specific weight of someone who has been your only constant and knows it. And then we walked down those courthouse steps together. Past the reporters, past the cameras, past the version of this story that other people would tell differently depending on what they'd seen and what they'd missed. I didn't look back. I'd stopped looking back a long time ago, not out of hardness, but out of the specific wisdom of a woman who had learned, at 17 on a driveway with a suitcase, that the direction you had to walk was forward. And that forward, kept long enough, could become something nobody who'd watched you leave would have been able to predict. It had. It absolutely had.